Let's talk about some of the most useful modifiers for modeling. Alright, I'm going to create a box. And the first modifier I like to use a lot is the edit poly modifier. So what it basically does is it converts everything below it in the modifier stack into an editable poly. So you can go in and select your edges, vertices, move them around, scale them, extrude them, and so on. And the good thing about this is that you can turn it off and on like a layer. So it's non-destructive. Everything you have below it stays intact. Let's move on to the symmetry modifier. This is another extremely useful modifier, and what it does is basically mirrors one side of the object to the other side. You can change the axis of the mirroring and can flip it around. Or you can select the sub-object, it's called the mirror, and you can move it around manually. You can rotate it and do whatever you like with it. Right, a great thing about the symmetry modifier is that you can stack more than one of them in the modifier stack, and it can give you some pretty interesting effects. For example, I'm going to create a few more. Now when you go back to your edit poly and move around one of the vertices, okay, you can see that it moves around in all these mirrored parts as well. So this is sometimes very useful for creating some complex shapes and objects. Right, the next modifier that is pretty much essential for high poly modeling is the turbo smooth. It basically does what the name says. It smooths your object and it's pretty fast. It's somewhat like taking a piece of sandpaper to these sharp edges and smoothing everything. Okay, you have a couple of options here. If you have a slow computer, you can set the iterations to 1, for example, so you can get a simple preview in your viewport that is fast to move around. Right, and you can turn on these render iterations as well. And this way you will see the low poly, or the medium poly version in your viewport, but when you render it, it's gonna be much smoother, like this. Right. You can also turn on the isoline display, and this will simplify the edges you can see to the basic mesh below the turbo smooth modifier. It's sometimes useful if you need a simple view of the model, but I like to turn it off so I can see the edge distribution better. And so that's the turbo smooth. And another modifier I like to use a lot is the FFD. There are a couple of options here: 2x2, 3x3, 4x4, box. Let's start with 2x2. So what it basically does is it creates a control box. And it sort of works like simplifying the mesh a lot. So instead of you moving all these hundreds of vertices, you can move these 8 to adjust the overall shape. For example, I'm going to move this one. It's very fast way to adjust the overall shape of your object. We can move them, scale them, rotate them, just like you could with regular vertices. Alright, and 3x3 and 4x4 are basically the same thing, but with more control points. So you can pick one that fits your needs better and use that. Or you can use the FFD box to set your own number of control points. For example, you need 10 control points for the length and only 2 for the distance. So as you can see, it has a lot of possibilities, and it's a great way to work on the overall shape of your object. Right, another modifier that is pretty useful for 3D modeling is the shell modifier. For example, I have a plane here, and I want to give it some thickness. And let's collapse it to editable poly and delete a couple of polys. Alright, so I want to give it some thickness, some volume, and I can use the shell modifier for this. So you can adjust the offset for the inner amount and the outer amount. And you can also increase the segments if you wish. So it's a great way to give some flat objects some volume. For example, here's another use for it. If you have a 3D object, but you want to sort of give it some more volume, you can add another shell modifier. And there's a little side effect to this, that the original object stays inside, but you have these options here to select the inner faces or the outer faces. And if I select the inner faces, I can add edit poly modifier and quickly get rid of that. Just go into poly subobject and delete, and you have your outer offset. So it works not only for planar objects but for 3D shapes and objects as well. Right, so those are the basic modifiers I like to use for 3D objects, and now there are some more that I like to use with shapes. So for example, we have a line here, and the first most used modifier for shapes is the extrude modifier. So what it does, it basically extrudes the shape into a single direction, like this. If your shape is closed, for example like the circle here, you can also control the way it caps the ends. You can cap only the start or only the end, or cap them both, and you can do as you wish. Alright. So that's the extrude modifier. Another useful modifier for shapes is the lathe modifier. And what it does, it basically rotates your shape around an axis and creates a 3D object from that. Right, you can flip normals if they're facing the wrong way. You can increase the segments for some smoother results. And you can choose the axis. Alright, and you can select the sub-object. It's called axis, and you can move it around for some different effects. You can also rotate it, but it's mostly not too needed. Okay, so that's the lathe modifier. And another type of modifier for shapes is one that uses two shapes at the same time. For example, you have two shapes, and one is the path shape and the second one is the profile shape. And what you want to do is extrude this profile along the path. So you can use two modifiers for this. The first one is the bevel profile. You just pick the profile and it automatically extrudes. You can press 1 to enter the sub-object and scale it, rotate it, move it around, so there are a lot of possibilities here. Alright, and another modifier that does pretty much the same thing is the sweep modifier. Okay, so that's the sweep modifier. You can use some built-in profiles, or you can use a custom profile. I'm going to use a custom profile here. And it has some different options from the bevel profile. For example, you can choose the pivot alignment. This way you don't need to manually rotate or move your, you don't need to move your profile anywhere. You can choose which point is used as a starting point. You can also set your offset, and this works the same way as if you would move your profile sub-object in the bevel profile modifier. But you don't have an interactive way to do this in the viewport. You can just use a numeric value here. It's a bit more precise, but it's not so easy to adjust straight in the viewport. And you can also rotate the profile as well, or mirror the profile in two directions. Right, so basically you can achieve the same thing with both of these modifiers, but they just have a slightly different way of doing things. So choose the one you like more and use that. Right, so the last modifier for the shapes I like to use is the bevel modifier. It's particularly useful for some faceted glass or windows or whatever. For example, you have a shape and it needs to be a closed shape, and you can add the bevel modifier, and what it does, it allows you to extrude the line in multiple steps. For example, you want to first extrude it alright, let's extrude it 2 centimeters up, and then add a second level, extrude another 2 centimeters and outline, let's say -5 centimeters, or okay, -5 centimeters, and you have this beveled shape ready to use. And if you have, for example, another shape you need to use the same settings for, you can just drag and drop the modifier and have the exact same bevel. So that's a pretty useful thing as well. And for the modeling modifiers, I guess those are the most important ones, and the rest of them is not used as much or as often.